Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another DPReview team discussion. Today on the table is going to be the Hasselblad X2D II 100C, new medium format from Hasselblad that I believe I got the name of correct. Can anyone check that?
Sounds right.
I think
At least I didn't say R2D2 this time.
That's right.
So everyone, we've got on the call today Abby Ferguson, our news writer. Say hi.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
And then we've got Dale Baskin, our managing editor.
Greetings.
All right. So let's just real quickly go over sort of what we're going to be talking about today. For those of you who may have missed it, I don't know if anyone did, but Hasselblad released a new camera this week. It's the X2D II 100C. As its name implies, it's a 100 megapixel medium format camera. And it's sort of a revision of its original X2D using what we assume is probably the same sensor, but it's got a fair number of tweaks to it that honestly add quite a bit. So the first is continuous autofocus, right? It can, the previous one only had single autofocus and manual autofocus. Well, now this one's capable of tracking subjects, including people, cars, and cats and dogs specifically. But then it can track pretty much anything that you pointed at using sort of some more autofocus points compared to the original and a LiDAR sensor. So we're seeing some influence from DJI, which is majority stakeholder in Hasselblad, because they have also included LiDAR in some of the cinema products. But it's also got this new feature where Hasselblad says it has end-to-end HDR, which means that it can produce ultra HDR JPEGs or HEIF files that, when you view them in compatible software, show sort of the highlights in a very spectacular fashion. Abby or Dale, have you gotten the chance to look at any of these yet?
Not from this batch. I have seen Sigma did kind of a similar deal, and I did see some of those from that camera, but I have not had a chance to see the Hasselblad on a HDR display yet.
Yeah, likewise, I have not had an opportunity to see these on an HDR display. I did experience it with the Sigma BF, and I'm excited to see more of it, though.
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting point. Obviously, these will require sort of dedicated hardware to see, or hardware that's capable of showing HDR in all of its glory. However, with the camera, part of the end-to-end part is that it actually has the display on it is a 1400 nit 3.6-inch OLED, and it can also show the HDR images in a way that I would say most cameras that shoot HDR cannot. So you can actually see the results right on your camera after you've taken the photo.
Yeah, Mitchell, we may want to discuss a little bit about the kind of HDR we're talking about here, because it can get confusing in photography, because we've had HDR around for a long time using methodologies such as taking multiple exposures for highlights and shadows and then merging them and tone mapping them to fit a standard display that's not necessarily an HDR display. And just to be clear, what we're talking about here is not the ability to map an HDR image to a SDR display, but to capture an HDR image for an HDR display so that you can see that full range of brightness on a display that's capable of producing it. So it's a little bit different than what some people might be thinking.
The effect is far more similar to what you'll see on phone photography, although those use multiple exposures to get that effect. This one is just utilizing the fact that its raw capture has more dynamic range than sort of the 8-bit standard JPEGs that most cameras output to. Yeah, that's a really good point.
And I think it's fair to say, if you've seen HDR images on a really good HDR display, it's spectacular. It can feel much more lifelike. And we often look at print on the wall, and print on the wall can be beautiful. I've got plenty of them, but they don't necessarily reflect how things look in the real world when you're standing there, because they don't capture enough of the dynamic range of the scene. If you've got a really good HDR display, especially something like a really good OLED display that's capable of those deep blacks and the bright whites, a scene can look almost just like it did in front of you. Maybe not quite. I mean, the sun shining straight in your eyes is not going to be quite the same effect, but it feels much more real than we're used to seeing in a lot of other photography mediums.
It's definitely a different experience than the HDR that we're kind of used to and was popular in mid 2000s ish. Definitely different experience when you see a good HDR screen with a proper HDR photo.
Yeah, and we actually got an interesting comment on the initial review of someone who said, I've never bothered to look at HDR photos on my PC, and I've just tried it with these, and wow, they really do pop, especially the interior photos, and they mentioned, that they would potentially want to revisit some of their other photos that they'd taken and re-export them in HDR. And I think that's an interesting point because while the Hasselblad does use HDR by default for its output photos, most cameras are capable of producing raw, like HDR from their raw capture, because again, it's going to be more bit depth than the standard 8-bit JPEGs. You're usually talking about 12, 14. Hasselblad and other medium formats can do 16. As to whether or not there's that much benefit from that, debatable. But it is something that you can probably play around with today, provided you have a capable screen. It's just Hasselblad is making it much more accessible. Also, interesting point is that Hasselblad is extending this to the X2D and the other camera that they have that I can't remember the name of, not in the camera itself, but if you download the photos from those cameras or the raw files from those cameras into the Focus 2 app, you can reprocess them and export them in these Ultra HDR JPEGs or HEIF files.
I am really looking forward to seeing more of this, and I'm excited to see that Hasselblad is making this move, as well as Sigma about a year ago or earlier this year, I guess. And the reason is that HDR for photography, it's a very much chicken and egg situation. The infrastructure is not widely there for people to see HDR photos on things other than smartphones. And so, who starts? Do we need the display first? Do we need to create the photos first? Yeah, somebody has to start making that first move to move us into a full HDR workflow. And look, in some ways, the mobile phone providers have been at the forefront of this. And granted, it's easier with a small screen to probably mass distribute HDR screens, but a lot of smartphone users have gotten used to these things. But we're in this challenging situation where I don't think any of the major camera companies want to commit to this full HDR workflow, because so many of their customers, may not understand it, may not want to learn about it, or just may not want to wrap their heads around it right away. Or a lot of them have a professional workflow where they just need to buy the new camera, start shooting with it, plug it into their workflow, get results, and get paid for it. And I completely understand that. And I do think Hasselblad is in a unique situation here where they serve a different market. They are not serving the high throughput photographers of the world. They're not serving the people that just don't want to learn. If you're going to buy this camera, you're probably doing it relatively deliberately because you're looking for a certain type of experience, and you're probably looking to do some of these things that Hasselblad is enabling you to do. And let's let those people start showing the rest of the world what can be done if we adapt to an HDR workflow. And I think it makes sense for a company like Hasselblad or Sigma that's a little bit niche to be the ones that can enable this and show how it's done.
And to be clear, it's not that you can't do this sort of workflow on other cameras. In fact, the Sony A7R can do HLG HEIF files, although with the quite notable caveat that comes at the cost of recording RAW. You can't shoot both, unlike this, though Panasonic also allows you to do that, and you can shoot both HEIF and RAW. But the fact that it's on by default, and the fact that Hasselblad is pushing it, we mentioned the Sigma BF because it did do the Ultra HDR JPEG output, but they didn't mention it. It's not in the press materials, it's not in the manual, it just kind of happens. We found it by accident, and we're one of the first outlets to actually even notice that it did this, because I happened to have a MacBook that had the latest version of macOS on it.
You're right, Mitchell. All of these other cameras are certainly capable of capturing content that can be mapped to an HDR workflow. But I can honestly say, I interact with a lot of photographers and a lot of people that own cameras. I can probably count on one hand the number of people I've met that are actually using those for an HDR workflow, and maybe have a few fingers left over.
Abby, you teach a lot of people who are sort of new to photography. Is that something that you get questions about, or is it something that people don't even know to ask for?
I have not had that question yet, so I think it's something that people don't even know to ask for at this point.
It's interesting because it is so ubiquitous on phones, and yet we just don't really expect it when it comes to these dedicated cameras.
Well, I think on phones, it's just so integrated into what you're doing on your phone that people don't even necessarily process that it's on the phone. It's just there and it does it automatically and you don't have to think about it. Things look shiny and nice and that's all there is to it. So I would hazard a guess that most people aren't even thinking about the fact that it's on their phone. But it is interesting that that isn't something that has come up at all.
Of course, while this is a flagship feature, that is not all that this camera is. We got an interesting comment where someone said, you know, it's not an action camera. Obviously, that's not really what this class of cameras is designed for. But they said very tempted by the design, the ergonomics, the simplicity. Is that something that appeals to you too? We'll get to the price later.
Hey, let's talk about that design, because I think this is one place where Hasselblad has it nailed. Now, I'll be the first to admit this is kind of a big, chunky camera. You're right. It's not an action or sports camera. In fact, if I think back to the original, I think it was the Hasselblad X2D. Not only was it not a sports camera, it wasn't a camera that you used if you wanted to shoot something that was going to move out of place within the second or so after you press the shutter button, because there was so much lag when you press the shutter when it first came out. So if you look at that camera, and Mitchell, you shot it, you've held it in your hands, it is a work of art. These Hasselblad cameras are beautifully machined pieces of metal. And I almost don't want to go out and shoot them. I want to put it in a display case under a lamp in my office because it's such a gorgeous thing to look at. So the one thing Hasselblad has actually done, I mean, they've absolutely done, is they've created a masterful work of art of industrial design. Is it the most efficient thing to use? No, not always. But I have never not enjoyed using one of these Hasselblad cameras.
Yeah, and I mean, I shoot medium format film, which is a beast of a process. I have my medium format camera here, which you can see is a little bit bigger than the Hasselblad. So design-wise and form factor-wise, it's definitely an appealing option. I haven't held it in my hand, but I've seen photos of it in other people's hands, obviously, and it's so nice and petite for a medium format camera. So the idea of getting that size of sensor in something that compact is just awesome to me. It's definitely an appealing option.
When Richard Butler and I were together and shooting sort of with this camera for the first time, we also had a Z5 II from Nikon with us, which is a full frame camera. And obviously, you know, the X2D II is going to be a bit bigger, but we were pretty surprised at like how comparable they were in terms of size. And I don't want to, you know, denigrate the Fujifilm GFX series at all, because those are perfectly, you know, good looking cameras and they have a lot of benefits over this camera, but I just don't think they are quite as nice looking. You know, you don't buy them for their design, you buy them for their capabilities. And I think that is something that Hasselblad does really well on this. They make their cameras a very desirable object. In fact, Abby, I think you mentioned at one point, like, it is kind of one of your dreams to own a Hasselblad camera of some sort.
It is on my bucket list to own one. I don't even necessarily care which model. It could be film, it could be digital, but it is a bucket list item for me.
We had a commenter on one of our forums, Gonna Snap, say that shooting with the Hasselblad imbues a sense of status to the photographer, and that's just like something that's inescapable with such high-end equipment. Is that part of the aura for you, or is it just the history and legacy?
I think it's a combination of things. I think it's that there is status associated with the brand. It's definitely a history and legacy thing. And they just, like Dale said, they just look like nice cameras. They're just really pretty devices. They just are well designed and look really nice. So it's many things.
And I'll go and say one other thing. When you're shooting them, in my experience, they also imbue a sense of zen. And, you know, we've talked about how these aren't necessarily sports cameras. And we always talk about film cameras, and particularly medium format film cameras, as the type of thing that slows you down, makes you consider what you're doing a little bit. And look, you can shoot this thing relatively quickly. As soon as it turns over one frame, you can shoot another. But I do find when I'm using these Hasselblad cameras that they do put me into a zone. that I don't get into with other cameras. It's a little bit similar to shooting a really nice Leica camera, for example. There's a certain appreciation for the machinery that you've got in your hand as you're doing it. And it can give you a different perspective on how you're approaching and shooting something, because part of the enjoyment is using this beautiful piece of equipment that someone has taken the time to mill out of a solid block of whatever it's made out of this time around. So I think there's definitely an experience that you get from it.
I would say undoubtedly the UI design adds to that. It's very clean, very minimal, puts sort of the basics and essentials of photography front and center in a way that not every camera does. One thing that I found really interesting, and so did some of the commenters, is the fact that now the X2D II includes haptic feedback motors. So when it acquires focus and when it says, hey, you know, I think this is in focus, or when your spirit levels are lined up, if you have the spirit level showing, it has a very slight vibration in your hand before you press the shutter to let you know that it's ready. And it goes a surprisingly long way to making it feel like, you know, we always talk about as photographers, this feels like an extension of my hand or an extension of my eye. And the fact that it is like physically moving your body does a really good job at that. It's like the next level of it.
I wish other camera manufacturers would do this. I love this on my smartphone. So I use an iPhone, and one of the apps I use all the time on my iPhone to shoot photos is an app that's called Halide. Probably a lot of people are familiar with it, but one of the reasons I really like it is it does have that haptic feedback. You can set it so that when you get just level, you get the little bump in your hand that's almost imperceptible, but it's there. You don't get that with the built-in iPhone camera. And I love the idea of having something like that. And particularly because I'm one of these people, you know, I don't get my horizons off by 20 degrees or anything, but I have a knack when I'm shooting, you know, a lake or something like that, of getting the horizon line just off enough, you know, maybe 1 degree off enough that in the resulting photo, it's a little bit crooked. And I love the idea that I could just get it to a certain point, even with that, you know, level view in the viewfinder, where it just kind of bumps me and says, you're there.
I'm super obsessive about having everything level and straight vertical lines. Maybe it's from all my time shooting real estate, but having that haptic feedback when I get things lined up would just be the most satisfying thing.
It does feel like there's a mechanism clicking into place. And it's interesting because this feels like a, you know, Dale, you mentioned that you can get this on using a special app on your iPhone, but it's also been a feature in some action cameras as well. It does feel sort of like a contribution from DJI, and the fact that it's more from the consumer end of things and less from the photography world, because it's just not something that most cameras do.
I'll call on other camera manufacturers right now to consider putting this in their cameras. It's a great feature.
Well, see, it's funny that you mentioned that, because last week you called on manufacturers to start putting, you know, internal storage on their cameras, and that was because the Ricoh GR's, you know, 53 gigabytes of storage. Well, this makes that seem pale in comparison, because it has a full terabyte of storage built in.
Yeah, see, they're listening. It worked.
Well done, Dale.
Let me have my fantasy.
This is exactly how product timelines work, and the X2D original definitely did not have a 1 terabyte SSD.
Right.
It did. But yeah, no, it's a very nice quality of life thing. And while a terabyte would probably be overkill on a camera like the Ricoh GR4, with a camera like this where your raw files are 200 megabytes each, you're gonna start to use up a lot of space.
Let me ask you guys, do you think we might start seeing this on more cameras? We've seen it on a couple of cameras now, obviously the Hasselblads, but also the Sigma BF did something similar where it has internal storage. And granted, I don't think there's going to be a mad rush for camera manufacturers to suddenly put storage into their cameras, because the ultimate result would be increases in price, and prices are already going up already. So I don't think it's likely. But what would you guys think about having this become more of a standard thing across the industry?
I could see it. I could especially see it on like kind of the beginner consumer based models, because then those types of users aren't having to go out and buy different accessories. So to me, it kind of makes it a more approachable thing. Like with your cell phone, you're not going out and buying a memory card. And so having your first dedicated camera where you don't need to take that step as well, I think takes one, I mean, albeit small, but one barrier out of the process. So I could definitely see it happening.
I will say it does seem like it's been showing up on sort of these niche, not like mainstream workhorse cameras. And I feel like I would be surprised if, you know, the Sony A1 III comes out, or the A9 III comes out, or an A9 IV comes out and it has built-in storage. It just seems like sort of more of a consumer oriented thing, or I guess, you know, maybe a studio oriented thing with Hasselblad, where the price is so high that you can just kind of do that.
Abby, I think you make a really good point that it actually would make more sense on entry-level cameras.
Yeah.
I understand, look, if I'm shooting an A9 III and I'm shooting on the sidelines of a football game, I need to swap out those cards really quickly, get them to the runner, get them online or to the paper I'm working for, or whoever. But I can see a real argument for having these in entry-level cameras where a lot of consumers just don't want to deal with the memory card. They'll probably buy one memory card and never change it anyway.
Right.
I totally agree. There's just a magic to like taking something out of the box and just being able to, you know, take a picture of the first thing you see with no steps in between. That's a really great experience. Though we've mentioned price a couple of times. This is not a cheap camera by any means. However, I said this before, it is one of the only products we've seen this year that is in fact cheaper than its predecessor. So the original X2D was, I believe, $8,100, in that ballpark, $8,200, and this one in the US is $73.99. Was that a surprise to anyone else?
Yeah, no, I'm surprised at that, and particularly given the improvements. I mean, the last one was no slouch. I've shot with it. It's a gorgeous piece of equipment. It makes amazing photos if you know how to use it right. But given some of the upgrades that we're seeing in this particular camera in the current economic climate, it's really surprising that they were able to do that. And maybe it's because they're just trying to figure out how to get it more widely distributed. Maybe they figure at a lower price point, they'll just pick up that many more customers and make it a little bit more mainstream. But yeah, either way, it's surprising in a very pleasant way.
Yeah, I was shocked by it. That's definitely not something we expect right now, with prices going up for every single company across the board. So it was definitely a shock.
Of course, I can only speak for myself, but I don't know if the $800 savings, as generous as they are, really do make this camera any more attainable for me. But especially with the fact that the lenses for this system cost so much because they have leaf shutters built in, definitely a benefit there. But you know, it does add to the price of each purchase.
Well, considering none of us is rushing out to buy the new Sony RX1 R3, I guess this is probably in the same category.
It is, though. It is interesting, Dale. You mentioned the fact that the original X2D was no slouch, but it does feel like the addition of continuous autofocus does make it feel like a more versatile camera. It's not maybe something that you'd want to take out and do street photography every day, but you definitely could with it now that it's got sort of a more advanced autofocus. It doesn't feel like it's just limited to high-end studio or portraiture work.
I think that's a really good call out. And I will admit that was one of my frustrations shooting with the X2D, is not having continuous autofocus when I become accustomed to it really made it a little bit more difficult when I was, say, shooting people and they tended to move around a little bit at an event. It made it more difficult, and you know, it was that extra little level of work you had to do to get it done. And the fact that it now can identify a subject like a person and provide some continuous autofocus, I think really takes this camera to the next level. Not in the sense that it's breaking new ground. Like almost every other camera with autofocus in the world can already do this at this point. But for Hasselblad to add it just makes the camera that much easier to justify if it's the thing that you think you need to do what you want to do.
Sort of on that note, we had, you know, there's been a fair amount of comments about this camera, and not all of them have been positive. So one person, you know, noted to them they thought that HDR just a gimmick, and it doesn't, you know, it's not a change to how the RAWs are shot. It's just for JPEG, and you know, who shoots JPEG with this sort of camera? Does anyone have any ideas? Like, would you use JPEG on this camera or HEIFs?
I think with this HDR format, yeah, if they were just basic JPEGs, no, I would not do that. Or not with the RAW format, sorry, with the HDR format. But with the HDR format, I think it's a different story, and it opens up possibilities that weren't there before. I think I probably would have to kind of play with it for myself to decide between RAW and HDR file. But I think it is more than just a gimmick. I think there's definitely more to it. And once you start to see it in action, I think you realize that it's more than a gimmick.
I will say that as someone who generally follows a raw workflow for almost everything I do, I generally don't use out of camera JPEGs for much. But the few times I have found myself trying to do an HDR workflow, usually trying to just understand how it works and figure out what the workflow looks like, I have to say I end up doing a lot less editing to a photo in an HDR workflow because it generally looks a lot more realistic right out of the camera than what I'm accustomed to. And maybe as I get more sophisticated about it and I get more used to looking at these things out of larger cameras other than a smartphone, yeah, I'll probably get better at identifying what I need to tweak. But I do find that the photos out of these HDR-based cameras just look more realistic right out of the camera, and I don't have to do much to them.
I think that's a really good point. And, you know, obviously people who are using this in the studio or for really high-end paid work, they're still going to be editing those RAWs, potentially to HDR, potentially to SDR, however they do that workflow. But like I was saying before, it opens some more avenues for this camera. This camera feels like it's more suited to a couple other things. And yeah, I could see, you know, taking it out on the street and then sharing some photos on Instagram, just straight out of camera, especially if they're going to show up on everyone's phones like they're used to. Obviously, that would be way overkill. You don't need one of those cameras for that. But if you have one, you know, why not? Now, that isn't to say that, you know, HDR is sort of perfect or entirely the way there yet. For one, it's only available in certain modes. You can't use it in continuous autofocus with this camera. So if you need to shoot something at 3 frames per second, you're out of luck for HDR unless you want to process it afterwards. Nor is it available in manual mode. Hasselblad basically told us, you know, if you're shooting in manual mode, you're going for a specific look, and we don't want to mess that up. We want to make sure that what you are envisioning is exactly what you're getting. And I think that's fair.
I think it makes sense. No, I think that totally makes sense. You're going to have certain photographers that are kind of power users and want control over every little thing. And for them, HDR probably is not going to be the answer. There's going to be a lot of kind of post-processing to adjust colors and things like that people who use HDR probably are not doing. So I think not allowing it on manual mode definitely is a logical move.
I am going to call out Hasselblad for one thing that they improved this time around, though. And look, I know Hasselblad has kind of had this philosophical approach to manual mode. And like you said, Mitchell, the concept is if you're shooting manual, the assumption is you know what you want and you're looking for a distinctive thing, and we don't want to get in your way. So you said everything. One implementation of that is on the previous X2D. As I recall, you couldn't use auto ISO in manual mode because, again, the thinking is, well, if you're shooting in manual mode, you need to set that ISO to get the look you're trying to achieve. This time around, though, I think they have had auto ISO added to manual mode, have they not?
They have indeed. Yes, that is available. So you can, you know, treat it as sort of shutter aperture priority and let the camera determine the brightness via ISO versus, you know, only or having to set that as well. And I agree that makes it sort of much easier to shoot with. You know, not something I do in the studio where I'm probably just going to peg the ISO to the base, which is 50 on this camera. But, you know, for taking it out into the world, taking sort of more ad hoc photos, yeah, it's a great improvement. More sort of slight asterisks to HDR is that the JPEGs, we mentioned the Ultra HDR JPEG format, it achieves HDR by taking a standard JPEG and then applying a sort of brightness map on top of it. And this has the benefit of making it so that basically any software that can read a JPEG can read that. Now, you won't necessarily get the HDR effect for that. You have to have software that supports that, but it's much more compatible than other options. There are some downsides. The gain map is lower resolution and only mono, so it's not going to be as accurate of a reproduction as sort of a true HDR file that was built from the ground up to be like that. But I don't know. For me, the Ultra HDR JPEGs, which you can see on our website if you click through on the gallery, I think they get the effect across pretty well. And that sort of goes to the other file format available to you for HDR, which is HEIF files. And those from this camera have very limited support. Even sort of the regular macOS and iOS tools that usually support this file format, because it's also what the iPhone shoots, they can open them, but they can't use the HDR sort of highlight feature that you would get in sort of Hasselblad's Focus 2 software and on the back of the camera. And that's a bit odd to me. I don't know if that's because of how they've implemented it, where it's using the P3 color gamut, or what that is. The photo has the data. It's just not easy to see unless you're using Hasselblad's tools by default. One other note about Hasselblad's tools is, and I believe you've wrestled with this fact, Dale, the RAWs cannot be edited in Capture One. Is that correct?
Oh, hit me over the head with a frying pan. Yeah, this is a frustration. Well, especially at DPReview, because our standard workflow for shooting sample galleries for lenses is to process them in Capture One. And it is a limitation. If you're a Capture One user, and I love Capture One, it produces beautiful results. But if you're a Capture One user, you're not going to process these photos in Capture One. You're probably going to use the Focus software or an alternative product like Adobe Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw or something like that. So yeah, it's a pain point of frustration. And I know I've seen at least a couple comments online since the camera was announced from people that say, wow, this actually is the one thing that might keep me from getting this camera, because I'm potentially the target user, but my entire workflow is built around Capture One.
Yep, and that's really unfortunate. I think you know, we don't need to go into the whole history of why that may be, but you know, do some searching on your own time. You might find some connections there.
But Lord knows it's caused us no shortage of grief when we've been trying to shoot lens galleries for Hasselblad cameras.
One other complaint that I saw about this camera, and I suspect this will be top of everyone's mind. You two are immediately going to be like, "Oh yeah, total deal breaker," and that is that it does not shoot video.
You know, it's so funny because we so often hear these comments that say, you know, I don't want video on my camera. Take video out of my camera. If you just take camera X, Y, or Z, remove the video features from it, I'll buy it. I have to admit, I never quite understood that philosophy, because you can just decide not to use the video features if you don't want to. I mean, I understand people don't want to pay for the video features, but as we've pretty firmly established, taking the video features out of a camera will probably increase the price, so that there's not, well, there's a fallacy to that whole argument. I lost my train of thought. Where was I going? What was the question?
It was just, you know, we've seen some complaints that it doesn't shoot video.
Yeah. And so the funny thing is, I did see one complaint online where somebody said, well, I love this camera, I just wish it had video. And that floored me a little bit, because I figured this would be the one camera where people wouldn't care.
Abby, would you miss video on this camera?
No, I would not miss video on this camera. Granted, to be fair, I'm not someone who shoots video basically ever, but I also just feel like there are plenty of very high-end video cameras that could do everything you need to do, that it's fine to have a very entirely stills-focused device.
I think it's a good decision, actually, by Hasselblad. I think this photography is clearly aimed at photographers. This is a photographer's camera through and through, just like a Leica rangefinder. Sure, if it shot video, yeah, the capability is probably there. Fujifilm puts video on their medium format cameras. I don't know how many people use it. I'm sure some people do. But I do think this is the right call from, excuse me, I almost said Leica, from Hasselblad on this particular camera, based on who it's really designed for.
I will say, you know, you said Fujifilm puts video in their medium format cameras. I would say that video is sort of one of the defining aspects of the GFX 100 too. And, you know, maybe that person, the one person who complained about this, I'm not trying to make it seem like that's a widespread critique of this camera, but the one person who is unhappy that it doesn't have it, potentially look at the GFX 100 too. I think that's,
and I do wonder if part of Fujifilm's motivation on this is the broader market, because they're not limiting themselves to purist photographers. They're coming out with a whole cinema camera line based on that medium format sensor, the Eternal line. And if they've developed all of the technology, all of the software and everything already for that camera line, if you can drop it into a GFX camera for almost zero cost, I get why they would do it.
I have not thought about the GFX Eterna since the GFX 100 RF event, when that was sort of the one last thing. I feel like that's got to come out soon, right, at some point. But anyway, that's not Hasselblad. I don't think we'll be seeing, you know, a Hasselblad moon footage video camera anytime soon.
Well, here's a good question: should they be taking this new Hasselblad to the moon?
Absolutely, right? Like, I think we're trying to go back. So, you know, I found the camera for you.
I think Nikon's got that one sewn up.
I think that's true. Oh, no,
If you're looking for a Hasselblad, I know there's a few lying around on the moon that are available if you can get out there to pick one up.
If one of the Nikons doesn't make it, they have a backup.
Well, as I recall, I don't think they brought the cameras back, did they? I think, like everything else, they had to get lifted off the moon with as little weight as possible, and anything that weighed more than a couple of grams, they basically chucked out the door of the lander before they took off, and I think that included the Hasselblad cameras.
It's the one time you really want to make sure you've taken the film out.